As you've probably seen in a few of these video essays, podcasts, historical snippets, whatever you want to call them, the 1994 season is a season that can just be labelled a fiasco. It's something that a lot of people would rather forget for a variety of reasons. Death, injuries, politics, allegations of cheating, a championship finale that will be debated until the end of time, the list pretty much ends there. You've got the big reset when it came to the driver aids that had been helping drivers for the previous year and a bit. Williams had been the ones to get the stuff working, and through 1993 a lot of teams had their own automatic gearboxes, traction control, anti-lock braking systems and active suspension systems. And yes, I know it's just a video game, a simulation, a game for grown-up men, but that McLaren MP4 8.5 Factor 2 is just weird. You can brake later than in anything else, mash the throttle harder than in anything else. You don't even have to change gear yourself. You can drive one-handed. It's actually really dull. But this had its downsides. The banning of those driver aids had come when most of the teams were in the process of designing their 1994 cars, meaning that for 1994 these cars were designed for the driver aids, only to not have them, and then this caused a bit of a problem, which we've already seen multiple times. It is 1994 after all. So not only had several drivers been involved in accidents causing them to miss races through injuries and 2 drivers being killed, there was also the background murmurs of the Benetton team using illegal software on the cars. Senna had been stood at turn 1 at Aida having been eliminated from the race and was convinced that Schumacher's car was running something iffy, because the noises he heard were synonymous with traction control, or so he claimed. Some reckon it's an on-throttle blown diffuser that was doing it, because that was something some of the teams had at that time. It made the cars a bit twitchy on turning, but it was there. It wouldn't be until 2011 or so when they managed to get them to blow off the throttle as well. And with Ratzenberger and Senna, the man who was convinced that the Benetton was illegal having been killed at Imola, everything now was just snowballing upwards. Benetton was now being looked at by the rest of the grid as well as the FIA, which in turn was in the midst of its knee-jerk safety changes following the events of Imola, as well as the injuries sustained to Leto, Alesi, Wendlinger and Lamy. While F1 looked like it was carrying on as normal to the regular person at the races and watching at home on the telly, it must have seemed like a different world for those actually inside the sport. Meanwhile, Damon Hill, now leading the Williams team after the death of Senna, which in turn has parallels to how his dad had led Lotus after Jim Clark was killed, was not in the best of moods. The British press, being the absolute bottom feeder that it is, was all over him because he wasn't able to beat Schumacher. Then he had suspension issues in practice which probably didn't help him out either. Silverstone had also gone through some major changes, despite having major upgrades a few years prior. The FIA had lowered the curbs at Maggots and Beckett's, which was put in for the 1991 season to reduce the chances of a second Barrichello-style shunt. Copse, Stowe, Vale and Brooklands were all tightened, with the modifications shown in green on the map, and these were again parts of the track added in 1991, as well as the chicane being added at the Abbey Kink, which is now turn 1 in the aftermath of Pedro Lamy's massive shunt in testing earlier that year. I wonder if they had social media in 1991, they'd be crying about the layout being ruined. Either way, it was home Grand Prix time for Damon and for Williams. This would also be the last race for flat-bottomed F1 cars, as the floors would be changed to keep the ride heights up. As a result of the circuit changes and the changes made to the cars, the times were about 6 seconds slower than before. The crowd was treated to a good show, as it was between Hill, Schumacher and Ferrari's Gerhard Berger for pole. The three traded the fastest laps before Hill went fastest. Just. Schumacher tried to go out and beat the Williams but made a mistake that cost him a bit of time, despite being faster until that point. Berger meanwhile went out to try and beat the other two but clapped the wall on the pit exit, meaning the car was too badly damaged to do a final YOLO lap. The top three was separated by just 0.02 of a second, Schumacher 0.003 off Hill. Alesi in the other Ferrari was half a second off, and then Hakkinen in 5th, over a second off. The Simtek of Gunon in last place, 5.7 seconds off the pace. So then comes race day, Hill ahead of Schumacher in front of the home crowd, and just like today they have to go through the formation lap. They are told to go, and within a few seconds of them beginning this formation lap, Schumacher overtook the Williams and stayed there, even going as far as to gap Hill a tiny bit. Schumacher stayed there until Stowe corner when he finally moved over to allow Damon back through. There's amateur footage of this that I'll link in the description. Also, remember at this time, Stowe wasn't one of the final corners of the lap because turn 1 in these days was at Copse, so Schumacher had been ahead of Hill for a good chunk of time. But when they came around, they were all in the right order and Damon lined up first. But then the start had to be aborted because Coulthard in the other Williams was waving his hands about to say he'd stalled the car. So the start is aborted. Protocol is that Coulthard had to wait for everybody to pass him, take his place at the rear of the queue, and then start from the back, with the field required to do another formation lap. On this formation lap, Eddie Irvine's Jordan decided it wasn't going to work anymore and came to a halt at Stowe. And during this formation lap, Schumacher overtook Hill again. Several accounts say that on one of the formation laps he did it twice, so it's a minimum of 2 overtakes, maximum of 3. The reports are at least consistent, saying that the third overtake happened in the latter part of the lap, so through Brooklands, Luffield, so yeah, I don't know, take that bit with a pinch of salt. Either way, the cars all lined up in the correct order, and the race got underway. That is, unless your name is Martin Brundle, as the Peugeot engine in the back of his McLaren went pop as soon as he left the grid slot. Damon would lead the Michael through turn 1 and for the rest of the lap. At the same time, the stewards were frantically faffing around behind the scenes trying to work out what the hell had been happening on those 2 formation laps. So this is where we get into the thick of it. The stewards decided to penalise Schumacher under Article 118E and Article 120 of the 1994 sporting regulations, which states 30-second board. 30 seconds after this board, a green flag will be shown at the front of the grid, whereupon the cars will begin a formation lap, maintaining their starting order with the pole position driver leading. During this lap, practice starts are forbidden and the formation must be kept as tight as possible. Passing is only allowed in order to maintain formation. Which goes into Article 120, which states, any car which fails to start or to maintain starting order during the formation lap must start the race behind the last line of the grid and must be stationary when the red light comes on. If this car is not stationary when the red lights come on, it must, on circuits where this is practical, go into the pits at a reduced speed. It can then start from the pits as specified in Article 117. The stewards decided to give him a 5-second stop-go penalty as he'd violated 118E. Stop-go penalties were relatively new at this point. Prost had been given one at Monaco the previous year for jumping the start. This had, ironically, given Schumacher the lead. Schumacher's penalty came through on the TV screens on lap 13. On lap 17, Schumacher came into the pits for a routine pit stop and went on his merry way again. Everybody understood that it was as it said on the TV screen. Michael Schumacher, stop-go penalty. Benetton meanwhile assumed that this penalty would be given to Schumacher post-race, but that only happens in the final 12 laps of a Grand Prix, something we'll touch on later in this bit. On lap 21, the black flag came out, and that would mean that Schumacher was disqualified and would have to return to the pits immediately. Schumacher claimed he never saw this black flag, similar to how Nigel Mansell had claimed not to see his black flag during the 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix, which he claimed he never saw due to "the sun was in my eyes." He then crashed with Senna, which was probably not a good look. What then gets confusing is that on lap 27, Schumacher finally served that stop-go, and the black flag had stopped being shown a few laps before that. Tom Walkinshaw had been with race director Roland Bruinterade trying to get this stuff figured out, because of the following. There is a chunk here of the 1994 sporting regulations that are relevant to this part of the story. I'm not going to read all of it. I'll just let you pause and read it at your own leisure if you absolutely want to, but I'll just pick out the pertinent parts from Article 162 up to 164F. 162. It shall be at the discretion of the stewards to decide upon a report or a request by the race director if a driver or drivers involved in an incident shall be penalised. 163. The stewards may impose a time penalty on any driver involved in an incident. So in this case, Schumacher violating Articles 118E and 120. 164. Should the stewards decide to impose a time penalty, the following procedure should apply. And this is where it gets confusing. A. The stewards shall, no later than 15 minutes after the occurrence of the incident, notify the relevant competitor of the time penalty which has been imposed. Now this part is the part that people tend to bring up. Schumacher's penalty was made public around 20 minutes into the race, probably due to the stewards trying to figure out what to do with him and consulting the rulebook. Probably because it had never happened before. E. Any breach or failure to comply with Articles 164C or 164D will result in the car being stopped. F. Sorry, I've been on the internet too long, I can't read that letter out loud by itself anymore. If an incident for which a time penalty is imposed occurs with 12 or less complete laps remaining to the finish of the race, the steward shall have the right to add the time penalty to the elapsed time of the driver concerned. Initially, Schumacher was allowed to keep second place and the 6 points, but was still fined $25,000 because he had, after all, continued to drive after being issued a black flag. You can keep your position because, you know, we messed up, but you still ignored a black flag. But then Benetton and Schumacher were hauled before the World Motorsports Council, where, well, they were less lenient. Schumacher was disqualified from the race, so therefore scored no points, and was then given a 2-race ban on top of that. As well as this, the whole Option 13 thing was still going on, and Benetton was being looked at really closely because of what had happened at the start of the French Grand Prix when Schumacher had just, well, bolted. Only about a week, 2 weeks later, did the FIA find out that this whole Option 13 thing could be turned on if you put in the right cheat code, as it were. And this isn't something that is exclusive to Schumacher either. After that incident in Brazil where Martin Brundle nearly had his head taken off by Jos Verstappen's Benetton, the FIA handed Eddie Irvine a 1-race ban because they thought he was the one at fault. When Jordan appealed, that ban was bumped up to a 3-race ban. But it still leaves a huge amount of confusion, discussion, and some questions about the season as a whole. These aren't my questions, by the way. This is stuff that has been said by others, but I thought were interesting and have put them into this little list. Number 1, why did it take so long to give the penalty? I mean, I did touch on the fact that maybe they needed to figure out exactly what to do, so I don't know, benefit of the doubt there. I know there's going to be some emotionally charged comments on this video. I've come to expect it by now. Number 2, was it done to try and make the season a closer affair than it would have been if Schumacher was able to carry on? He'd have won the opening 7 rounds of the season if not for his gearbox troubles at Barcelona, and was leading by 37 points going into this round. 3. Was the ban given to avoid any bigger penalties surrounding the Option 13 thing? While the FIA did find this Option 13 software, kicking Benetton out of the championship with everything else going on would have made F1 look really silly. This was one way of avoiding it. And was this the reason for the 2-race ban? Mansell only got a 1-race ban for what happened at Portugal in 1989. With everything else that happened that year, did the FIA see fit to make an example of Schumacher? Either way, Schumacher had the last laugh. He became the champion that year, and 4 years later at Silverstone, he came into the pits on the final lap to serve a stop-go that meant he technically served after the race end, despite the stewards giving him the wrong penalty. And this is a video I did ages ago, it's in the archives if you want to watch it. At the same time, Hill had done something his father Graham never did, win the British Grand Prix. But this incident is just another chapter in the absolute mare that was the 1994 season. So then, a look at the confusion surrounding the Michaels 1994 British Grand Prix disqualification. If this has opened up the interesting door for you, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job, and get subscribed with a bell on for all the latest. Massive thanks to the kind folk at Patreon who are on your screen, and if you want to help pay the bills around here, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and the F1 Store affiliate, where if you buy F1 gear, I get a kickback. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.